Good afternoon. Gabrielle Tayac's words are beautiful, and as we look out the South Transept, those of you who have had a chance to do that, at those beautiful waters, we think of those waters both as life-giving and at the same time also as having brought forms of social death to these shores. So we're gathered here in many ways this year across this nation, remembering 1619, which we use as a kind of placeholder, although there are other cases, earlier cases of enslaved peoples in North America, but it does sort of mark the beginning in British North America. But we have to think of that larger period that Dr. Tayac has just reminded us. If we think of the period from the very beginning of the 17th century even to 1619 as a kind of period of genocidal violence, which in a sense opened up the economic, social, and political possibilities with the gradual removal, though not complete removal, of indigenous peoples for the importation of people of African descent. And I want to tell some aspect of that story today, thinking of, in my title, In Bondage on the Heights, as we recall the enslaved families of African descent who lived and worked on the very ground that we now occupy, with particular attention to the early decades of the 19th century. So we start with a photograph that is taken almost 3 decades after emancipation came to Washington, D.C. It's a somewhat enigmatic photograph from the Sidwell Friends archives. I should mention, in the interest of inclusivity, that while I graduated from Sidwell Friends, Fath Davis Ruffins, who we're going to hear from a moment, is a proud National Cathedral School graduate. So we have all bases covered. And as I ran cross-country on these grounds competitively many, many years ago, it had never occurred to me either the indigenous presences or the enslaved presences that were so important in shaping socially, economically, and ultimately politically the very space of the cathedral close that we're now in. So here we have a very enigmatic photograph, only identified with the words on the back, Rachel, cook, and her daughter, in 1885 from the Highlands. This is the area just behind what's now Zartman House at Sidwell Friends, what was known as the Highlands, part of the Nurse family estates that are so key to the story of slavery and liberation in this part of the district. And as we'll see, it's very likely that these are individuals some of whom were enslaved by the nurses who worked the very ground that the cathedral is built upon. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But going back in time a little bit, it's important to think about the particular position of D.C., to think a little bit about the expansion of chattel slavery in the United States. So, of course, for a long time, if we follow 1619, so there's a parallel history of destructive assaults, of course, on Native Americans, as chattel slavery, people of African descent, are engaged in a kind of second involuntary middle passage into the North American interior, coerced, with very complex relations, often with Native communities, which we might talk about a little bit later. But as you see this loop playing, it's important to remember that this area around the district, the Chesapeake, was, of course, farmed continuously for over 200 years before the ending of slavery by enslaved people. What this meant was a transformation in the local political ecology, primarily through tobacco, but other crops. So agricultural production became less effective, and in a certain horrific sense, we can say that this particular area became increasingly devoted to the growing of enslaved people who were then shipped either into the North American interior, across the Allegheny, across the Appalachians, or through maritime traffic, as you can see, going down especially into that concentrated area, Louisiana, Mississippi, the killing fields. So D.C. played a critical role, and that's very important to our story, to remember D.C. was a kind of cross point. Many enslaved people were sold, families were torn apart in the district, and even after 1850, when it became illegal to sell people in principle, much of that traffic simply moved to Alexandria. So there's a long and horrific story of families torn apart. We are all familiar, I think, with the Georgetown University story, one of just a tip of an iceberg. So with that in mind, let's talk about this area that was once known as Georgetown Heights. outside. So we're now standing in what would have been, for much of the 1800s, what would have been unincorporated Washington County, not within the District of Columbia, but not Washington City itself. And so here we are north of Georgetown, of course, in Georgetown Heights. And this is an area which had quite a number of enslaved people on the eve of emancipation. Here are some examples of major slave owners, still prominent families, many of them deeply connected to the history of this place of worship, of course. It's a little hard to see all the numbers. This tract of land was known as Pretty Prospects. There was a lot of land speculation as Washington, D.C. was established, and George Washington and his friends were, in a sense, doing a good deal of land speculation. Here are some, so I would say in this immediate area, within a few blocks, you would come to about 15 white families who owned about 120 people. And we're going to talk in particular about this property here that was owned by the beginning of the Civil War by Carolyn Nurse Delaney. We'll also talk about Rebecca Morris Nurse and enslaved people there, and so forth. So there's a long and complex history of land speculation in this area, which many people have tried to painstakingly reconstruct. And it's not clear that enslaved people themselves were physically on this particular area of land, but we know that in a sense the land was shaped through the operations of capital, of investment, and finance speculation, and that was all undergirded, as it were, through enslaved people. So Benjamin Stoddard, William Deakins, Uriah Forrest, well-known land speculators between 1795 and 1797, were all moderate slave owners. John Rosby Platter, who then acquired this land. We know a good deal about his enslaved people further down in eastern Maryland because during the War of 1812, 48 of them were liberated by a British warship and resettled in Nova Scotia. He was very upset about that and eventually sought reparations from the British for that. And we have a series of land transactions leading ultimately to Joseph Nurse acquiring this land around 1817, and at that point he brings in at least about 10 to a dozen enslaved people. And there's also a story that involves Dr. Samuel Busey, who we'll touch on in a moment. So here's a more familiar map, those of you who know this neighborhood. So here we are talking about what was then Mount Alban, Joseph Nurse, and then came out of the Nurse family control, but eventually passes to his granddaughter, Dr. Samuel Busey, a prominent physician, member of the Know Nothing Party, a notorious racist and anti-immigrant figure in 19th century Washington, and the Highlands, the current grounds of Sidwell Friends School, very closely related in terms of the enslaved people who seem to have moved back and forth between these two sites. So Joseph Nurse, of course, a legendary figure here in the district, the first register of the U.S. Treasury, served through five administrations. We know in 1800, when he's coming down from Philadelphia to help with the establishment of the federal government here in D.C., owns 6 enslaved people, according to the census. There's a fascinating story, and I will defer to David White, who's actually in the audience, who's extensively researched the early history of the Samuel Jackson property on Cedar Hill. This is Dumbarton House, of course, which is now located on Q Street, but I think was a little further down. David will correct us, but somewhere, because Q Street had to be sort of, I guess, moved right through the property. So somewhere in there, that's where Joseph Nurse would have acquired, and David just shared through, it was actually through a sort of bank foreclosure, complex financial instrument or foreclosure. And so we know a number of enslaved people, thanks to the good work of the Dumbarton House staff, of course, the Colonial Dames of America headquarters. So we have a number of people, and it's always hard to tell from letters and so forth who's enslaved, who's indentured, who's being rented, because there was a great deal of renting of enslaved people in the district, renting out. But we do know for sure that Dinah, who was the cook, at least for a quarter century, there's a reference to a letter because she at one point goes out for some kind of, quote, ramble without a child, and Joseph Nurse threatens to sell her off to Georgia, which did, of course, happen a good deal. Doesn't appear to have happened. We know that Bacchus Motz was able, apparently, to acquire his own freedom in 1807. And then there are others, and we're not quite sure, but we know, of course, at least at 1800, at least of 6 or so people. Anyway, Joseph Nurse does leave, for those of you who are sort of following the story, goes up to Kalorama after he gives up that property, and then moves up here by 1817 to the area that was then pretty prospect, and he renames it Mount Alban, honoring the story, of course, of the first English martyr. So again, to sort of keep track of this, we're going to talk about 3 properties that are interlinked that seem to have enslaved people who were probably related to one another. And the centering just here it says C.R. Delaney, Joseph Nurse's granddaughter, who owned this land and had at various times through her husband a number of enslaved people that seem to have been brought in for Virginia. And then there's Charles Josephus Nurse, the son of Joseph Nurse, also a slave owner, and then Samuel Busey, who in the years just before the Civil War acquires the territory, the land that's now Beauvoir, that's now the elementary school of the National Cathedral system. All right, so let's start with the Nurse Delaney family right around here. This is a map that's a little bit later than when our story starts. So we know that there was a farmhouse here. It may have been built by Richard Harrison, or it may not have. There's some debate about this. And so just as you were entering into the west entrance of the cathedral, apparently that's where the house was. Carolyn Rebecca Nurse was a painter. We know that by 1820, right here on this property, Joseph Nurse has 8 enslaved people, and there are 3 free people of color also living in the household. The censuses keep on changing in terms of the amount of detail that they give us, but at least we know the sexes and age and relative age spans of these individuals. We do have a bill of sale. Joseph Nurse then in 1827, and that may be a significant date, purchases one Negro woman named Anne, aged about 35, and her 5 children, to wit, William, Lee, Samuel, and Nathan. And most of those individuals don't seem to stay in the Nurse family possession, because we find them enslaved by other white slave owners in this immediate neighborhood. But at least one of them we'll see. So it seems to be a family, a mother and her children. And almost certainly, since that seems to be the year that the Highlands, the building that becomes the administrative headquarters of Sidwell Friends, that's when the Nurse Jr. family, the Charles Josephus Nurse family, really sort of sets themselves up for business in that space that seems to have been inspired a bit architecturally by Mount Vernon. There are lots of close connections between the first families and the Nurses. And there's a sort of consciousness of privilege and prestige. And part of that may well have been Joseph Nurse is probably purchasing for his son, Charles Josephus Nurse, and Rebecca Wister Morris Nurse, his wife, who'd come down from Philadelphia, probably purchasing this enslaved family to work with them and sort of give them a start in life. And we know that because suddenly in 1830, 3 years later, Charles Josephus Nurse does have 7 slaves. And Joseph Nurse doesn't seem to have in that year any more slaves than he did before, just a natural increase of 1. By 1840, Joseph Nurse has hit very tough financial times. As many of you know, he had a falling out with the Jackson administration. Andrew Jackson seems to have not been thrilled by the thought that Joseph Nurse had, I think, at one point 15 of his relatives employed in the Treasury Department, and one of his campaign promises was to clean out the nursery, as he called it. And so what that means is we're not exactly sure, though, what happens to those enslaved people. Are they sold off? I haven't yet seen records of this. Are they transferred perhaps to another property? The Nurses owned a great deal of land through what's now Rock Creek Park and so forth, most of which ends up in different kinds of financial entanglements with the bank. But by early 1840s, the property then slowly falls out of the control of the Nurse family. There's the establishment by the mid-1840s of the St. John Institute for Boys, a kind of forerunner of St.Albans. And Reverend Anthony Ten Brook is then brought down from Orange, New Jersey to sort of give the school a second go. as the principal and the director to serve as rector. And that period is quite important, as we know, to the history of what becomes the cathedral close. Phoebe Nurse, who is one of the daughters who's growing up here, when she dies relatively early, she leaves a bequest for a church she hopes on Alban Hill, said to be inspired by Anthony ten Broeck, and then Carolyn Delaney, the Nurse Delaney, the granddaughter of Joseph Nurse, does give at least a half acre for St.Albans Church. It's a very familiar story, but it is interesting. There's another angle which I don't think we've reflected on before. Now, so here's, as he's setting up St. John's Institute, that becomes the educational forerunner, and in a sense, along with the church at St. Alban, the free church, the free Episcopal Church, becomes a sort of foundation and inspiration for the eventual founding, of course, of this beautiful cathedral. So his labor, the labor that he's depending on to sort of keep everything running in these two institutions, primarily men and women from Ireland. But then if you go over to now a separate document, which is the slave schedule for 1850, you'll see there he is, Anthony ten Broeck, and he does in fact own one enslaved woman, listed as a female, 30 years old, black, born, as to say, around 1820. I've not been able to find anything else, but we know certainly that that woman was here and was heavily involved, probably both in the church and in this ecclesiastical school that's the forerunner of really everything that is to happen here. So that's sort of interesting to think about. And the very funding, of course, that leads to the vestry, that leads to this first church that then sort of inspires the coming of the cathedral, is obviously made possible through the uncompensated work of enslaved individuals. Some of this history will be familiar to many of you. Commodore Beladen Tasker Delaney in the U.S. Navy then purchases the property. Carolyn, the granddaughter of Joseph Nurse, does an advantageous marriage. He's able to acquire this property, bring it back into the family. And at that point, the evidence is a group of enslaved people are brought up from Fauquier County into Virginia, part of the extensive Delaney holdings. The Delaneys are both in Maryland and in Virginia. When he dies in 1856, Carolyn acquires the property, about 29 acres at that point, and at least a life share in some of the enslaved people. So we know a good deal about them, actually, thanks to the 1860s slave schedule. There's severed enslaved people. We know their ages and relative colorations. And then in the district, as many of you know, we have more knowledge than practically any knowledge that we have of the other 4 million enslaved people of African descent in the United States. Because in 1862, Congress decided, of course the Civil War was already underway, decided to engage in a form to require emancipation of all enslaved people in the district, more or less, and then to retain the loyalty of their white owners, many of whom had Confederate sympathies. Congress voted some payment, some compensation. But to get that compensation, you had to fill out all sorts of forms indicating the names, the ages, distinguishing physical characteristics, and in some cases the skill sets. So it's an invaluable for those who work on African American genealogy, the DC part of the story. And if we match them up, here we have Fanny Brown, who's 32, and what appear to be her children, Mary Brown, Sarah Brown, Louisa Brown, Lucy, Walter, Rose, and then Winifred Meade, who may not be related. Per se, we have a family group that we know is here. We can match it up almost exactly with the 1860 census. There's a missing 10-year-old girl, and then there's a boy and a little girl who's been born since the 1860 census. But we see quite a nice matchup. And so at least we know those names of individuals who were unquestionably right on this property and enslaved. Let's move up a little bit, up to a little north to Sidwell Friends, to the Highlands, which was constructed between 1817 and 1827 by Joseph Nurse's son, Charles Josephus Nurse, we are assuming that enslaved people played a role in the construction of that house, though we don't have direct evidence of that very beautiful house. Which many of you are familiar, right? And here is James Nurse, the grandson of Joseph Nurse, who lived there for a long time with Mary Nurse. And here we have another view of the Highlands, of course, the administration building of Sidwell. So we know by 1830, Charles Josephus Nurse is at the Highlands. He has 7 enslaved people. And by 1840, he has 4 slaves. But it doesn't mean that that's the extent of his holdings. That's what's listed in the census as residing there. And it's quite possible that others have been rented out around the district, especially skilled labor. That was an important income source for many white slave owners in Georgetown, in the Georgetown Heights area and in Georgetown itself. 1840, by this point, Joseph Nurse has really hit very tough financial times. There are no enslaved people, and he's going to die the year later. But here's where it gets interesting. 1850, we have 4 enslaved people up at the Highlands, and these are interrelated almost certainly with enslaved people who worked on this property here. But we also have 2 men of color, free men of color, William Brooks, a coachman, and Anthony Hutchinson. And the interesting thing is, William Brooks is just about the right age, and there are a few hints that he may well have been, if you recall, in that sale back in 1827, there was a will, and there's some evidence that, in fact, he was. This is the same Will, William Brooks, who's now free. Now, when we fast forward to 1860, if you can bear with me for a moment, we now see something very interesting. There are a whole new group of free people of color, Sarah Brooks and what appear to be a group of children, Theodore, William, David Brooks, Margaret, John, and but we're not sure where William Brooks is at this point, but he does show up 2 years later in the most surprising way, because while these appeals are listed as being free, there's no pre-1860 emancipation papers anywhere in the district files, which the district was pretty good about keeping track of that because they were enormously anxious about free people of color who they thought might be a risk to the public order. That's what the white leadership, the white power structure thought. But there in 1862, look who's applying for compensation from Congress for the enslaved people that he owned. It's William Brooks himself, this free man of color, and he is asking for money for Sarah Brooks and all the children. So presumably he had managed over the years to purchase from the white nurse family, his own family, but he hadn't actually gotten around to filing anything yet. So he decides in 1862, it makes financial sense, presumably, to seek compensation. But you can see, if you look very carefully down here, Sarah Brooks has also written her name there as saying that she has rights to this money. And then it gets pointed out to her, no, she's still enslaved, although she's thought of herself as free for several years. And so she's crossed out so that all the money will go to her husband. And the extra money for her, which was several $100s, goes into the family coffers. It's quite illustrative of the narrow and sort of fuzzy line that existed between the statuses of slavery and freedom in the district, especially post-1850. It was a very terrifying time. There were some privileges associated with being technically free, but slave catchers were constantly coming in, creating sometimes ludicrous claims, asserting that people were fugitives and re-enslaving them. So the story, of course, of Solomon Brown, 12 Years a Slave, is just one of many. And it gives you an idea of this very shadowy lines between slavery and freedom. So it is fascinating, I find, that he's seeking a compensated emancipation. Now let's just quickly move over just to where Beauvoir is, to Dr. Samuel Busey, who acquires this property just behind where we're standing now, the very lovely elementary school now, around 1850, and gradually builds a very grand Italianate mansion. Here, again, we assume there was enslaved labor involved, and he does have a number of, so we're looking now, this is the construction of the cathedral, so back towards Reno Road, we're seeing the property. We know that by 1860, he has 8 enslaved people whom he owns. And again, we're able to identify almost all of them by name through several means, because 2 years later, he seeks compensated emancipation for having liberated them. And the names almost exactly match. The ages almost exactly match. There are a couple missing things, though. If you notice, there was a 33-year-old female mulatto and a 19-year-old male. We don't know where they are. Of course, there's a little boy who's now been born, Prince Rhodes. All right, so we probably are looking at, on this property that are just behind us, 2 enslaved families that were female-headed. And we don't know where that missing 33-year-old female is. Now, we do have a hint. Dr. Busey wrote a famous sort of autobiographical sketch of Washington and talked about the wonderful days before the coming of the Civil War, surrounded by, it was idyllic up here, he said, in the area that later became, sort of Cathedral Close and Cleveland Park. I was surrounded by willing servants and hired laborers to do my bidding, but once the war came, household servants disappeared, and farmhands could not be attained at any price. So we're wondering, who are these individuals? The 33-year-old mother, for example. Well, interestingly enough, and here I'm very grateful to our friends at the Anacostia Museum Library, who have copies of the Washington, D.C. jail records, because on 1861, September 27th, that is to say, the Civil War has started, but it's still another, 7-8 months before compensated emancipation is going to happen. In the D.C. jail, which was largely used for housing escaped or self-liberated people, enslaved people, it's a little hard to see, but it says Margarita Beale, or Bean, and Dr. Busey is placing her there for, quote, safekeeping, a technique that was often used to sort of terrorize enslaved people who had either made claims on certain rights, like petitions for freedom, or refused to follow orders or tried to escape. And he's paying $4.74 when he brings her out of jail. So we suspect he tried to free herself. We don't know who her husband is. There's an Alfred who Dr. Busey had inherited. Perhaps he was here still. There's another fugitive, the D.C. slave, topped up to Busey. I'll just wrap things up in a moment. And this is William Hawkins, who's delivered to Samuel Busey. It's strange because William Hawkins was owned actually down in the district by Charles H. Wilberger, a silver merchant. But clearly he's probably rented out here for a while as one of those farmhands, enslaved farmhands. I have a theory, which we can talk about later, about who was the father of the other family, probably over from the Pierce Klingle estate, Lydian. But anyway, moving ahead. I'll just quickly, we do have some sense the Beals themselves, that enslaved family of Dr. Busey that worked here again, we do see them showing up in various censuses in Tenleytown and around here. And the Brooks themselves, that William Brooks, who got compensation for essentially freeing his own family, shows up in Tenleytown, just up the road, in 1870. He's in the Northeast. So it seems likely that Rachel, who's in this picture here, was probably the woman listed as Rachel Oliver in the 1870 census, living with the Brooks family. She's probably Rachel Jackson, who had been owned at least in as late as 1862 by Mary Ann Clark, who lived just down Wisconsin in Calvert, just across the street. And so there's probably a lot of renting and so forth. So families are being, I think what's interesting about this picture is it reminds us that in the immediate post-emancipation period, families are, African American families are reuniting themselves and reconstituting a new way of being. And all of these families are closely connected and so forth. We have many tantalizing hints, which we could talk about exactly how everybody's interrelated. But the key thing is, we can at least say with great confidence, these names of 30 persons who were enslaved right here on Mount St. Albans, and whose labor did contribute to the establishment of this particular ecclesiastical institution and the schools over time. And I think it's important, it's of course enormously important, we're going to hear from a moment, again from Gabrielle Tayac, remembering the long history of indigenous presence here. And we should also honor these 30 names and the many who are still unnamed, enslaved people and then freed people of African descent, whose work was so long uncompensated and whose names were unrecognized. Thank you.